The woods were Elias Hale's only companions. His cabin stood on the edge of Fernlow Forest, the town miles behind him, barely a whisper on the wind. Elias had long ago stopped caring for the townspeople. They were young, always rushing, consumed with the distractions of the modern world. The truth was, the forest had offered him more than they ever could. Its quiet paths, its gentle rustle in the wind, these were the only things that had remained steady. When everything else had crumbled, the days stretched endlessly for him now. He woke with the sun, made his morning tea in the old tin kettle, and settled by the fire to read. His hands were worn from years of work splitting wood, mending fences, carrying heavy bundles of logs, but his heart was light. Or it had been once. There were mornings, though, when he felt the emptiness in his chest more sharply. These were the days when the silence was the loudest. The silence of the cabin, of his thoughts, of the world that continued on without him. He had known love once. A love like the morning sun, bright and steady. Lyra had been his light. She had brought him laughter and warmth, teaching him the rhythms of life that only a heart full of love could understand. Together they had shared everything. When they had built the cabin, it was a labor of both hands. When they planted the garden, it was with hope. She had taught him to love the land, to speak to the trees as though they understood, to listen for the stories carried on the wind, but those days were gone. Lyra's death had come slowly, like the fading of a season. At first, it was only a cough, a momentary breath taken wrong. Then there were the weeks of fever, and finally the quiet departure. No goodbyes, just an absence that lingered in the spaces between words. The house felt hollowed out, as if the very walls had lost their purpose. For years, Elias had struggled with the weight of the silence that had followed. He kept himself busy with his routines, always the same, always predictable, but the truth was, nothing ever felt the same. The house, the forest, even the sky felt different without her presence. That particular autumn morning, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air was crisp, the ground covered in a quilt of golden leaves, the trees swaying in the early morning light. Elias had been walking the old path near the edge of the forest, the crunch of dried leaves underfoot the only sound. His boots were well worn from years of use, their leather stiff but reliable. He paused at the old stone fence, where the forest met the clearing, and breathed deeply. The scent of pine and earth was thick in the air, mingling with the fresh bite of autumn. His eyes wandered over the landscape, watching as the shadows shifted, the light dappled through the branches. He often came to this place. The boundary between the world he had known and the wilderness that stretched endlessly before him, there was something about this spot that always gave him peace. But that day something was different. A sound broke through the stillness, a high, frantic cry that echoed between the trees. Elias stiffened, his senses sharp despite his age. His first instinct was to step back, but the cry came again, more desperate this time, followed by the sound of rustling, snapping twigs. It was the kind of noise that could only belong to an animal in distress. Without thinking, Elias hurried toward the sound, his boots skidding slightly on the fallen leaves. He moved quickly, despite the stiffness in his joints, his heart pounding. Not from fear, but from something else, an instinct, to help, to do something, anything. The cry grew louder, more urgent. As he pushed through the dense brush, the sight before him nearly stopped his heart. A young deer was trapped in the remnants of an old wire fence, struggling violently to free itself. The metal had cut into her skin, leaving deep bloody marks along her legs and side. She was too thin, and her eyes were wide with panic. Her chest heaving with each frantic breath. Elias froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The deer's eyes locked with his, filled with wild fear. She kicked out again, the metal biting deeper into her flesh. "No, no," Elias whispered under his breath, his voice soft, a balm meant to calm the creature. He had seen this before. Traps set by hunters too careless to check their snares. The forest had its dangers, and sometimes those dangers came not from the animals but from the hands of men. This, though, was different. This was his responsibility now. The man kneeled cautiously, making sure to move slowly. He knew the importance of calm. The deer's eyes were full of terror, But there was also a flicker of something else, something that told Elias she knew he wasn't a threat. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "I won't hurt you. You're safe." The deer continued to struggle, but Elias reached forward carefully, his calloused fingers brushing against her side. She flinched but didn't pull away. With gentle movements, he inspected the wire. It was wrapped tightly around her hind leg, digging into her flesh. It took all his concentration to work the tangled wire loose, and more than once, the deer snapped at the air, not understanding. But Elias was patient. Minutes passed like hours, but finally he managed to free her. The wire fell to the ground with a soft thud. Elias exhaled in relief, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The deer stood still for a moment, as if unsure of her newfound freedom. Then slowly she took a hesitant step forward. She turned. Her head to look at him, those wide, shimmering eyes studying him with an intensity that struck him deep in his chest. And in that moment, Elias realized something. It wasn't just the deer that had been freed. She was the first living thing he had connected with in years. His heart, so heavy with the weight of grief, had been given a small reprieve. "Go on," Elias said softly. "You're free now," but the deer didn't run. Instead, she stayed where she was, watching him. There was something in her gaze that was almost knowing. She was more than a frightened animal. She was an unspoken promise, one that Elias would come to understand in time. The days that followed the deer's rescue were a blur of quiet moments. Elias couldn't stop thinking about her. Every morning, he would take his usual walk along the old trail, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. At first, he thought it was just a fleeting connection, an odd occurrence, a brief encounter between two souls in a vast, indifferent world. But then she came back. It was a crisp morning in mid-November when he first saw her again. He had been sitting on the porch, warming his hands around a mug of black coffee, the steam rising in the cold air. The forest was still, the trees heavy with the weight of early frost. There was an unmistakable hush to the world in those early hours, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Elias caught a movement, a shadow darting between the pines. His heart skipped in his chest. There she was, the young doe, standing at the edge of the clearing, her head low as she cautiously peered toward the cabin. For a moment, neither of them moved. The deer's eyes locked with his, and the world seemed to pause. Her coat was the color of autumn leaves, warm and golden against the white of the snow beginning to dust the ground. She took a tentative step forward, her delicate hooves pressing lightly into the frozen earth. Elias blinked, unsure if this was a dream. The deer had no reason to return. He wasn't sure why he had expected her to. He had freed her, given her an opportunity to flee the place where she had been trapped. But here she was, staring at him with the same wide, unblinking eyes. "Hello, girl," he said, his voice low but steady. The deer stood still for a moment longer, as though processing his words, then to Elias's surprise, she took a few more cautious steps toward him. She stopped just a few feet away, her breath misting in the cold air. Elias couldn't help but smile. He stood slowly, careful not to startle her, and took a small step forward. He held out his hand, palm open, though he knew it wouldn't mean much to a wild creature. To his astonishment, she didn't shy away. Instead, she moved closer, her soft nose brushing against his outstretched fingers. Her fur was warm to the touch, and for a moment, Elias forgot about everything else, the ache in his chest, the loneliness that had settled into his bones. It was just him and this creature, standing in the cold light of morning. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said softly, his voice tinged with a tenderness he hadn't realized he had left in him. The deer let out a quiet sound, a soft exhale, almost like a sigh. Elias couldn't tell if it was a greeting or just the wind escaping her lungs, but it was enough. He knelt down slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. She didn't seem frightened. She merely watched him with a quiet curiosity. Over the next few days, Lyra he had begun calling her that in his mind, though the name felt strange on his tongue, returned again and again. Every morning she would appear at the edge of the clearing, waiting for him. Sometimes she would stand far off, just watching, her dark eyes following his every movement. Other times she would approach, cautiously, her body stiff with uncertainty, but she never ran. She never flinched. Elias began to set out small pieces of apple and carrots for her, the kind of treats he used to give to Lyra, his late wife, when they still had a garden. It was a simple gesture, a way to share something, even if it was just food. Each time, the doe would eat the offering, but she wouldn't linger long. She always seemed to be watching him, gauging his every move. It was during one of these quiet moments, sitting on the porch while Lyra ate the carrots he'd left for her, that Elias first spoke to her aloud. "You know, I haven't had anyone to talk to in years," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not anyone who listens, anyway." Lyra didn't respond, of course, but Elias felt as though she understood. Maybe it was just the way her ears flicked at the sound of his voice, the way her eyes softened as she chewed. He continued, his words spilling out more freely than he'd intended. "I've been alone for a long time now. More alone than I thought a person could be. My wife, she used to say that the trees talked to you if you were quiet enough to listen, but I think maybe I was too noisy. I spent all that time talking to the wind instead of listening to the things that mattered." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air between them. The deer finished the carrots, then took a step toward him. This time she didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the edge of the porch. Her hooves clicking softly against the wooden planks, Elias smiled again, a rare, genuine smile. He reached out, placing his hand on her soft fur. "Thank you for coming back, Lyra," he whispered, as though the name held more than just the memories of his wife. Perhaps it was a sign that, even in his solitude, something in him was waking up, something that wanted to believe in companionship again. She stayed close for a while longer, her breath warm in the cold air. Then, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, she turned and disappeared into the forest, her figure vanishing into the shadows as though she were nothing more than a fleeting thought. That night, Elias sat by the fire, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years settling over him. His heart, so long worn down by the silence of grief, felt a little lighter. It wasn't much, this strange companionship, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite as alone. The forest had given him a gift, an unexpected one, but a gift nonetheless. And in the days that followed, Elias began to wait for her, just as she waited for him. He didn't know why she came or why she stayed. Perhaps she was just a wild creature who had happened to find comfort in his presence. Or maybe, just maybe, she understood that they were both in need of something more than what they had been. Living with and so their bond grew, unspoken, fragile, but real. Every morning, Lyra came back, and every evening she would leave. Neither of them needed words. They had already found something deeper, something quieter, something stronger. Winter came early that year. The first flakes of snow drifted down like whispers in the dark, coating the ground in a blanket of white. Elias had grown accustomed to the cold over the years, and yet this winter felt different. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. The old cabin creaked as the wind howled through the cracks in the wood, and Elias could feel the weight of the cold creeping into his bones. But he didn't mind. The quiet stillness of winter was something he'd always loved. There was comfort in it, in the way the world slowed down, the way everything seemed to pause, as though waiting for the return of warmth. But that year the cold didn't feel so peaceful. It felt heavy. Each morning when Elias would go out to chop wood or tend to the small fire that kept the cabin warm, he could feel the weariness in his joints. His breath came in shallow puffs, his skin flushed pale, his hands trembling more often than they should. He had grown older than he realized, and time, it seemed, had begun to catch up with him. The thought would flit through his mind, and for a moment a dull ache would settle in his chest. He wasn't ready for this. Yet. There was no stopping it. Time marched on, regardless of whether he was ready. It was on one of these bitter mornings, just as the sun began to rise, that he found Lyra waiting for him outside his cabin. She was standing near the edge of the clearing, her coat dusted with snow, her breath puffing invisible clouds. The sight of her brought a smile to his face, a quiet warmth spreading in his chest despite the cold that clung to everything around him. Lyra had begun to visit him every day. Sometimes she would come early, standing at the tree line and watching him with those large, knowing eyes. Other times she would arrive just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, her silhouette a dark shadow against the fading light, but always she came, and always Elias waited. He had never asked himself why she returned. She was a wild animal, after all, bound by the instincts of her kind. She could have easily fled into the deeper parts of the forest, where the dangers of the world were far more pressing than the comfort of a stranger's company. But she came back, day after day, and every time it felt like a small miracle. It was as though they understood each other in a way that words could never explain. A shared loneliness, a mutual need for something they couldn't quite put into words. That morning, as Elias slowly made his way toward the porch, he spoke aloud as he often did when he was alone. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up, Lyra," he murmured, his voice soft, the words carried away by the wind before they could fully take shape. "My body's growing weaker, I can feel it. But I'll keep going for as long as I can, I will." The doe's head turned toward him at the sound of his voice. She watched him closely, as though hearing more than just the words he spoke. Elias felt a deep connection to her in that moment, something deeper than the simple gestures of feeding her or tending to her wounds. She was not just an animal to him anymore. She had become something more, a companion in a way that no human had ever been. And yet, Elias felt an uneasy truth in his chest. He was not going to live forever. The thought of leaving her, of abandoning this strange, unspoken bond, filled him with a sorrow he couldn't name. That night, he sat by the fire, a log crackling in the hearth as he stared into the flames. Lyra had come and gone as usual. Her visit was brief but enough. Enough to remind him that, for all his isolation, there was still a thread of connection between them. The quiet of the house was both a comfort and a cage. He glanced at the wall. Of photographs across from him, the smiling faces of people he had known in his youth, the echoes of a life that had long since slipped away. There was one of him and Lyra, the real Lyra, sitting under the oak tree, laughing, her hair wild and unkempt from the breeze. He reached out and gently traced her face with his finger. The ache in his chest deepened, but he didn't pull away. "I miss you," he whispered to the photograph, his voice thick with emotion. The wind outside howled louder as the storm clouds began to gather and the temperature dropped. Elias reached for the small woolen blanket draped over the back of his chair and pulled it tightly around his shoulders. His bones felt cold, his joints aching from the damp air. He could feel the weight of the winter pressing in around him. It wasn't just the physical cold. It was the coldness of isolation, of time passing without anything to anchor it. It was the coldness of knowing that no matter how long he waited, there would come a day when the deer would stop coming. The day when the forest would be empty once more. But that thought, too, was one he pushed aside. The following day, the storm hit in full force. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, blanketing the world in white. Elias stayed inside the cabin, bundled up as the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls. The fire flickered low, and the cabin felt smaller than usual, like the world outside had folded in on itself. And they were the last two creatures left in it. By evening, Elias was restless. He hadn't seen Lyra that day. He hadn't expected to. The storm had been fierce, and she was a wild creature, bound to the rhythm of the forest. She would have found shelter, he was sure of it, but as the night wore on, a quiet unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. Maybe it was just the storm, or maybe it was the growing chill in his own bones. But he felt a gnawing sense of loss. The wind howled louder, and the house groaned under the pressure of the snow. Elias stood up from his chair, grabbing his coat and hat. He had to check on her. He stepped into the snow, the world suddenly silent except for the crunch of his boots as they sank into the thick blanket of snow. His breath came out in heavy clouds, the cold biting at his skin. He knew the forest like the back of his hand, but in the storm it felt foreign, alien. The trees loomed like shadows, their branches heavy with snow. "Lyra!" he called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. He tried again, louder this time, but still there was no answer. The world felt as if it had been erased. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Just as Elias was about to turn back, something moved in the distance, barely visible against the storm. His heart leapt, hope flickering in his chest, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Lyra. Her coat was dusted with snow, her breath steaming in the cold air. Her head was low, her body tense, but she was alive. Elias didn't hesitate. He stumbled toward her, the snow making each step harder, but the thought of losing her propelled him forward. When he reached her, she turned her head toward him and took a tentative step forward, as though reassuring him she was there. Without a word, he reached out, placing his hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her beneath the cold. "Layer of snow, I won't leave you," he whispered, his voice rough. "Not ever." Lyra nuzzled against his hand, the bond between them stronger than any storm. The snow continued to fall in the days that followed, thick, heavy sheets of white blanketing everything in a soft, cold silence. The world outside had become a soft blur of gray and white, an endless stretch of snow-covered trees and hills. The storm seemed endless, and Elias felt it in every inch of his body, the chill in his bones, the weariness in his heart. He didn't mind the winter. He had always loved it. There was something sacred about the quiet that came with it, something serene in the stillness of the world when it was buried under layers of snow. But this winter it felt different. The days had grown shorter and the nights colder. Elias could feel his body betraying him more each morning. His joints creaked like old doors. His breath came in shallow gasps. The fire in the hearth was longer enough to chase away the chill that had taken root inside him. He tried to keep busy, to chop wood and tend to the cabin as best as he could, but his strength was failing. The weight of age and solitude hung heavy on his shoulders. The days blurred into one another. Each morning was a repetition of the last wake, eat, work, wait for Lyra's arrival. She came without fail, standing just beyond the clearing, waiting for him to approach. Her presence was a comfort, a steady rhythm in his life. But she had become more than just a visitor. She was his reason to get out of bed, his reason to move through the world, even when every step felt like an effort. It was the night of the worst storm that Elias felt it, the moment when the cold reached him deeper than before. The fire had burned low, and he was sitting in his chair, his legs heavy with fatigue. He had tried to keep his mind occupied with a book, but the words blurred together. His fingers trembled, a faint ache running through his chest. The heat from the hearth did little to quell the deepening chill in his body. He glanced at the window. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling through the trees, shaking the walls of the cabin. He had lived through storms before, but this one felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a pressing silence between the gusts of wind, and then through the fog of his thoughts he heard it. A soft sound, almost like a cry, carried on the wind. Elias's heart skipped. He knew that cry. It was Lyra. Without thinking, he stood, the dizziness in his head making him stagger for a moment. His hands gripped the edges of the chair to steady himself. But when the sound came again, sharper this time, his resolve hardened. Lyra needed him. Pulling on his boots with slow, deliberate movements, Elias reached for his coat, fumbling with the buttons. His hands were cold, shaking as he worked. Every movement felt sluggish, as though his body was resisting him. But he pressed on, determined to get to her. The wind nearly knocked him over as he stepped outside. Snow was falling so thickly that the world was reduced to a hazy blur of white. Elias could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him. He squinted into the storm, calling for her, but his voice was lost in the fury of the wind. "Lyra!" he shouted, his voice ragged from the cold. A low whimper rose from the depths of the forest, and Elias's heart seized. He didn't hesitate. This time he moved toward the sound, each step more labored than the last. The snow was deep, the wind biting at his face, but he kept going, his eyes searching the trees. And then, through the curtain of snow, he saw her. Lyra was standing in the clearing, her legs stiff, her head low, her fur matted with wet snow. She was trembling. Elias's heart thudded painfully in his chest as he hurried toward her. "What's wrong, girl?" he muttered, his voice hoarse with worry. "What is it?" Lyra turned to face him, her wide eyes filled with distress. She was in pain. Elias could see it in the way her body was taut, her movements slow and pained. The sound of her breath came in shallow gasps. He reached out, his hands shaking, and she allowed him to approach, though she flinched slightly as he touched her. He gently stroked her neck, trying to calm her, but something was wrong. He could feel the warmth of her body beneath his fingers, but there was a strange, unfamiliar heat to her skin. "Lyra, what happened?" Elias whispered, his heart pounding. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with something between fear and trust. And then he saw it, the wound, the dark, swollen patch of skin on her side, the blood crusted and matted into her fur. It wasn't just the cold that was hurting her, it was something deeper, something more dangerous. Elias's heart sank as he took in the severity of the injury. "She's been shot," he breathed, his voice thick with disbelief. His mind raced. The forest was full of dangers, and while he didn't like to think about it, there were hunters out there, people who didn't care about the rules. They killed for sport. Without wasting another moment, Elias carefully guided Lara back toward the cabin, his hands trembling as he supported her. The snow was thick now, the storm relentless. He could barely see the cabin through the veil of white, but he pressed on, determined to get her inside. When they finally reached the cabin, Elias helped her into the shelter of the porch. He locked the door behind them, then hurried to the fire, stoking the embers to life once more. The cabin was cold, but at least it would keep them both from freezing. Lyra was too weak to resist as he carefully examined her side. The wound was deep, the blood thick and dark against her pale fur. Elias cursed under his breath, panic creeping into his veins. He didn't know how to treat something like this. He wasn't a healer. He was just a man lost in the wilderness, holding on to the last fragments of a life that seemed to be slipping away from him. But he wouldn't let her die. The night stretched on as Elias worked. He used all the knowledge he had, all the old remedies and salves Lyra had taught him over the years. He cleaned the wound as best as he could, his hands trembling, his heart aching. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin there was only the warmth of the fire, the quiet sound of Lyra's breathing, and Elias's determination to keep her alive. By dawn, Lyra was resting on a bed of straw and blankets by the hearth. She had calmed, her breathing a little steadier, but Elias could feel it, the weight of time closing in on him. He had helped her for now, but the truth remained, he was running out of time. His strength was waning, his body growing weaker with each passing day. He could feel it deep in his bones. And yet, as he looked down at the deer lying peacefully before the fire, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had done what he could. He had given everything he had to help her. He would fight for her, just as she had fought for him. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt something like hope. The days following Lyra's injury passed in a haze of worry and tenderness. Elias spent every moment tending to her, his own aches and pains forgotten in the face of her need. His hands, though unsteady, worked with purpose, cleaning the wound, applying poultices, and feeding her whatever he could gather. He had never felt so exhausted in his life, but it didn't matter. There was no other choice. Lyra needed him. She was stable now, no longer trembling with the fever that had once racked her body. The wound, though still raw, had begun to heal, the blood no longer seeping through the bandages. Elias knew it wasn't a permanent fix. Nature would determine the ultimate outcome, but for now, she was alive, and so was he. But as the days stretched into weeks, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing within him. The lingering cold in his bones had become more than just the season. It had become part of him. His chest ached with each breath, and his body no longer the strong, capable frame it once was seemed to betray him more with each passing hour. He wasn't sure if it was the sickness, the isolation, or simply time catching up to him, but it was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Lyra, too, had grown stronger. Though still wary and hesitant, she now followed Elias more freely, trusting him with an unspoken devotion. She would lie by the fire in the evenings, her eyes heavy with sleep, but always looking up at him as though she understood his pain. his exhaustion. The fire crackled low one evening, casting long shadows across the walls of the cabin. Elias sat in his chair, his coat draped over his shoulders, his hands folded in his lap. Lyra lay beside him, her breath soft and rhythmic. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world still and quiet. The snow had settled into a deep, unbroken silence. The loneliness had returned. Elias hadn't realized how much he had grown to depend on Lyra's presence until now. The nights were long, and in the quiet moments his mind wandered to places it had been avoiding. He had given so much of himself to Lyra, cared for her in ways he hadn't cared for himself in years. But there was one thing he couldn't deny. His time was running out. He couldn't outrun it any longer. The thought had been there, lurking in the back of his mind, but now it was impossible to ignore. He could feel the weakness in his body, the tightness in his chest, the heaviness in his limbs. The storm had passed, but it had left more than just snow in its wake. It had left a kind of finality in the air. He looked down at Lyra, who had lifted her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, full of something he couldn't quite name. For a moment, it felt like she understood everything he was thinking. "You'll be okay, won't you?" he murmured, his voice breaking the silence. The question was more for himself than for her. "You'll find your way?" "I won't be here forever." Lyra's ears twitched, and she lowered her head once more, her side pressed against the warmth of the fire. Elias felt a pang of sadness, an ache that went deeper than his physical pain. He had given so much, but it wasn't enough. He couldn't hold on to her forever, and he couldn't keep the storm at bay. That night, Elias slept fitfully, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The fire burned low, and his dreams were a blur of shadows and fragments. He awoke to the sound of hooves outside the cabin. His heart leapt into his throat. Was it Lyra? He stumbled out of bed, his body unsteady as he made his way to the door. The cold air bit at his face as he opened it, the fresh snow crunching beneath his boots. His breath fogged in front of him as he looked out into the moonlit landscape, and there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was Lyra. Her silhouette was bathed in the soft light of the moon, her eyes glowing in the dark. She stood still, watching him with an almost otherworldly stillness. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two beings bound by a connection stronger than words. Elias's heart beat in his chest, his breath coming in shallow bursts. He knew what was happening. This was the moment. The moment where everything would change. Lyra took a tentative step forward, her body moving fluidly despite the weight of the snow. She walked toward him, her eyes never leaving his, until she was just a few feet away. The world seemed to shrink, the silence stretching between them like a tightrope. Elias's throat tightened as he looked down at her. He knew what he had to do. "I'm not going to make it through this winter, Lyra," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll be okay. I'll be at peace, knowing that you'll survive. You'll find your way. I believe in you." The deer lowered her head, her breath warm in the frozen air. She stepped closer, pressing her head against his chest. For a moment, Elias felt the weight of her presence, the warmth of her body against his own. Her heart beat beneath his hands, steady and strong, a rhythm that was both foreign and familiar. He could feel her trust, her quiet acceptance of the moment. "You've given me everything," Elias whispered, his voice breaking. "Everything." And then Lyra stepped back. She turned slowly, and for the first time Elias understood. She wasn't saying goodbye, not yet, but she was ready. She was ready to let him go. To go on without him, as she always had before. The deer took one last look at him, her eyes filled with something soft, something unspoken, before she disappeared into the forest, her form vanishing into the dark shadows of the trees. Elias stood there for a long time, watching her go, the weight of her absence already beginning to settle in his heart. When he turned back to the cabin, the fire had gone out. The silence pressed in, a cold, heavy quiet that seemed to echo through the walls. He stepped inside, his body trembling, but his heart somehow lighter. He closed the door behind him, sealing himself in the warmth of the cabin, and for the first time in years, he was at peace. The storm outside had ended. And the world was still. Elias sat down in his chair, the memory of Ira fresh in his mind. He didn't know how much time he had left, but he no longer feared it. He had given all he could, loved all he could, and in the end, that was enough. And in the distance, far beyond the trees, the sound of hooves in the snow faded into the quiet night.